One of the great things about a parliamentary democracy is that there is debate and there is challenge. And often that challenge comes from people with a perfectly valid but very different point of view. And that's going to be very important during the passage of the Railways Bill, which has now been laid before the House of Commons. Rarely does a bill get drafted absolutely perfectly from the very outset. The transport spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats is Olly Glover MP. He also sits on the Transport Select Committee, and crucially, he worked in the railway industry for some time before becoming an MP. He really knows his stuff. I met up with Olly recently at the Didcot Railway Centre in Oxfordshire. Olly is the local MP for the seat of Didcot and Wantage. We talked about a wide range of issues affecting the railway, including electrification, Olly's personal passion, the Railways Bill, the role government should have in the future, as well as rolling stock leasing, HS2, Northern Powerhouse, the reopening of old lines, and much, much more. The scrutiny of the Railways Bill promises to be quite the ride. Olly, we're here at Didcot Railway Centre. It's kind of appropriate, really, isn't it? Because we're celebrating 200 years of the railway. This is part of our heritage. And of course, you are the MP for Didcot and Wantage. Things like this are really important about looking at the past, but it is all about the future, isn't it?
Yes, I'm really proud to have Didcot Railway Centre in my Oxfordshire constituency, and it is right that we celebrate that heritage, particularly in this 200th anniversary of mainline railways as we understand them today. But I think there is also, perhaps we can be a little bit stuck in the past at times, and perhaps some of people liking diesel locomotives over electrification is perhaps an example of that. And yes, now it's all about looking to the future with this Railways Bill and hoping it will put us on a good footing for the next 200 years.
But you, of course, have got a strong background in railways. You have had a railway career. Tell us a bit about that. Was mainly Network Rail, or was it more operations than that as well?
I think it's about 50-50.
Okay.
So yeah, 2 stints at Network Rail, mostly on the operational side. Used to manage signallers, control centres, that kind of thing. A bit of projects. 2 stints in train operating companies, 2 different ones. Similarly, managing control centres and train drivers. Lots of very, very interesting and wide-ranging discussions with trade union colleagues in those roles. And latterly, I had a second stint at Network Rail, but also worked at East West Rail from a projects perspective, and a bit in a consulting firm in the 18 months before the election. So more about advising railways elsewhere about how to improve things. So yeah, a bit of a mixture, but you're mostly on the operational and project side.
You mentioned there the election. I've always been fascinated by this. What made you want to be an MP?
I get that question a lot, and it's entirely understandable why. I think it's a wide range of reasons, really. I think whilst I enjoyed my railway career, I think I always felt a little bit limited in terms of my role in terms of being able to improve things for passengers or freight end users, etc. And that's because the railway of the 2010s in particular, and actually even more so now, it felt that a lot of the big picture decisions that I really needed to be taken in order to improve things operationally were not really within the agency of the railway. They were more in the agency of Department for Transport, Treasury, Government, etc. So it's partly wanting to be a little bit closer to that world, but it was also wanting to do more. I really enjoyed having a career in railways, and railways are very important, but they're also a little bit niche, and I've got sort of big interest in lots of other societal issues. I did a lot of volunteering when I worked on the railway, like with kids with special needs, people who are homeless, Motor Neurone Disease Association, and I wanted to perhaps be more in that general space. But I think perhaps a trigger factor really was 2016 European Union referendum, campaigning for Remain in a cross-party organisation. That's the first time I did any political campaigning, and of course the result was not what I wanted to see, and that was probably one of the trigger causes of spurring me into a bit of a different direction.
When you think about a political career, though, it's quite a gamble, isn't it? Because if you stand for election with a party like the Liberal Democrats, who we're not a political podcast, so we won't talk about first past the post or proportional representation, but the chances of getting, say, a ministerial role are quite, you know, are less, perhaps less high than they would be elsewhere. Is that sort of mark of your character? I don't really need the big job. I just want to get in there and make a difference.
I mean, I would welcome the opportunity to be a minister one day, but for me, it has to be in line with what I believe.
Yeah.
And of course, the Liberal Democrats are not perfect as a party, but there is a lot that Liberal Democrats stand for in terms of environmental things, empowering the individual, making sure that the state and large companies are regulated so that they help the individual, not just themselves. Those are things that I do really believe in, and the Liberal Democrats definitely is the best match for me. So I wouldn't want to be a minister just for the sake of being a minister in a party whose values or track record I don't believe in. It definitely would need to be aligned. I'd have to be comfortable that it's aligned with my values and beliefs, and the Liberal Democrats definitely are.
Of course, though, you have got two big roles now. We'll start with the first one, which is the Transport Select Committee. So appointed to the committee where, you know, you can make a difference there because you can scrutinise, you can challenge, you can, you know, put ministers and officials under some detailed scrutiny. How do you find the Transport Select Committee? Is it kind of what you expected, I guess?
I think it broadly is. It's one of the aspects of my job that I enjoy the most, actually,
Okay.
and I think it's because select committees show Parliament at its finest, actually, and certainly with this Transport Select Committee, and I'm told definitely more so than some transport committees of the past, we really do generally leave our party affiliations at the door, and we work together as a team. And it doesn't really matter whether we're Conservative, Lib Dem, or Labour. We work together with the amazing support team who do a lot of do the bulk of the work in terms of, you know, researching what we're going to be looking at, suggesting really good lines of questioning. We work together to make the most of those sessions, to really probe and make sure we're holding the powerful to account, or, you know, the knowledgeable, getting the most out of those witnesses. So I do really enjoy that. It's not perfect because, as I'm finding, the general response to government to recommendations made in select committee reports is to reject nearly all of them. So that bit can be a little bit dispiriting. But you know, the cause is valiant, and you can really put the spotlight on some really important ideas and issues.
You know, ministers appear in front of them giving evidence. The things they say are on the record. You know, they can then be scrutinised.
Yeah.
So no, I get that completely. And you're absolutely right. Big shout out to the team behind the scenes. I know that Conrad and the clerk of the committee, they work really, really hard to make all this thing happen. Let's move on to your new role then. You're now the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for transport. Was that something you really wanted to be able to do?
I'd certainly very welcome the opportunity to bring some of my past expertise, not just in railways, but I'm also a keen cyclist, used to run a cycling campaigning organisation in Greater Manchester as an example. I'm really keen to bring that knowledge and experience to the role, but it's also part of serving the Lib Dems as being part of that wider team, being able to advocate for the party and hold the government to account, as we get the opportunity to do on a regular basis as the third party by a number of MPs. So yes, definitely excited to see what I can do with it.
Talk about serendipity though. You're appointed transport spokesperson, and within a matter of a few weeks, the railways bill is finally published. What's your sort of high level reaction to it?
I think there's some good ideas in there. So as an example, perhaps what I think is the boldest thing that's in there, or most radical, is requiring the government to set a 30-year strategy for the railways, because I think that's what has been so missing up to now, is that long-term thinking. Government has been too much in the weeds of short-term decision making rather than thinking, you know, as per the Switzerland example, which I've given many times in the select committee, and I know that's what you've talked about in your podcast before, very much saying this is where we want to be in 30 years, this is the timetable, this is the network capability we want to be able to deliver, and these are the infrastructure interventions that we're going to have to do along the journey. I think that is promising. My concern is whether the promise of that strategy will be realised in the actual implementation of GBR, and there's a lot that the bill leaves unanswered. So yeah, quite early days, I think.
At the heart of what this government's proposing, though, is doing, is nationalisation, is bringing everything that they possibly can or think is appropriate back into the public sector. That's just an ideological decision, though, isn't it? That's not really about running a railway better.
I agree. It is very ideological, and sometimes when you hear Lord Hendy, the rail minister, talk about things that he's done in terms of putting one person in charge of Network Rail Kent and South Eastern, the train operator, as an example, that is a good thing to be doing, but it has also happened before. That sort of thing has been done in the previous structure, South West Trains and Network Rail Wessex working effectively as one. So yes, there is definitely some ideology in there, and I just don't think in terms of our own railway, let alone railways from abroad, I don't think the evidence suggests that public sector train operations are automatically better than private sector ones, or indeed vice versa. I don't think it's the main issue. It's far more about how the industry is led, what objectives it's set, and whether there are some of those long-term policy and funding frameworks. So yeah, there is too much ideology in there.
So let's just talk about a couple of the features of the bill as we see it at the moment. And of course, it's one of those classic things. The bill's quite dry, but when you look at the notes and you look at the response, the consultation, more detail appears there. Let's go back to that long-term rail strategy. And you sort of hinted at it a bit. It's great to say we're going to have a 10-year, 15, 20, 30-year strategy. Second, there's another funding crisis, another problem. They just get binned anyway, don't they?
Well, that is the real risk, and you're certainly right to say that in and of itself, a 30-year rail strategy isn't going to take us to where we need to get to. But I do think it's an important ingredient that has been missing up to now, but definitely needs to be accompanied by a lot more, and actually particularly longer term funding settlements, and actually for something like railways, even longer term than the 5-year funding settlements which we've had under the control period system. And it seems the fetish for 5-year is going to be maintained in some of the GBR proposals. Perhaps needs even more than that, and by moving towards more long-term funding and long-term planning, particularly on things like electrification or new stations, by having that long-term funding and commitment, you could stimulate the supply chains and help to really bring those costs down, because all of the people who work on these things will become really good at them and will be able to bring that knowledge and good practice onto the next project, and therefore we get into a virtuous cycle of improved delivery and reducing costs, rather than perhaps the vicious spiral that we're in at the moment.
I heard Darren Kaplan of the Railway Industry Association, who's a very experienced lobbyist. He's been lobbied in many sectors and industries over, quite a number of years. And he said at the Railway Industry Association conference last week, by far, the hardest lobbying job he's ever had to deal with is trying to convince successive governments of different persuasions about getting out of boom and bust in the supply sector. And yet, we still haven't managed to do it. Do you think that is almost like one of the biggest issues then?
Well, the Select Committee did an inquiry recently into that whole boom and bust issue, and that was the overwhelming view of people who gave testimony to that inquiry. So it's definitely the case, and we keep falling into the trap. In the mid-1990s, there was this complete desert of rolling stock orders, and then a huge glut in the 2000s, which was good and bad in some ways. It's kind of, perhaps we missed an opportunity not to have a common type of train across the southeast network, the third rail network, for example. We've been in a similar place with rolling stock. With electrification, it's often been like that as well. So yes, and I've had a lot of engagement with Darren and the Rail Industry Association, and the way things are at the moment, the current bust period that we're in for electrification and other forms of infrastructure investment, the supply chains say they have never known it so bad, and they have never been more depressed. That is what they've consistently said to me.
And I'm not sure they can be quite as confident as some seem to be about this railways bill, because you mentioned there about the funding settlement. So it appeared to me like the control period is going to be replaced by a thing called periodic review, which is another 5-year thing. But yet that's for infrastructure operations, maintenance, renewals. Train operations is going to remain almost a bit of an annualised political whim. I know they'll talk about integrated business plans, but how can you have a genuinely integrated business plan if the funding for everything isn't on a longer term basis?
Well, I completely agree with that. There's been a lot of really bad decisions made over the last few years from the train operation perspective, and a lot of those have not been made by the supposedly evil and woeful private sector train operators. They have been government decisions. So, for example, in order to make a very short-term saving on leasing costs, scrapping train fleets like Class 365s and Class 455s when they had plenty of years left in them, and in some cases leading to a lot of short forming and overcrowding as a result. And also across the public sector, we see this terrible phenomenon of cliff edging of annual budgets, where people are terrified at not having a surplus, which that should be a good thing, by the way. And there's, let's quickly spend all of this in a month or two. I mean, it's such
And make bad decisions in the process.
and waste that money. It's such nonsense and so ridiculous. And there's lots of other examples in terms of things that I used to be involved with, like train crew recruitment and training, which can also be subject to those very short-term decisions. Yeah, I mean, that's another example of the pandemic, actually, is train operators letting lots of drivers retire because they're under cost pressures in the Department for Transport, and then finding people are coming back, and then we have a huge shortage of train crew. I mean, cross country, for example, they still have not seem to have gotten over that. So I agree with you. If the bill and the ministers are talking a lot about having an integrated railway, then the approach to funding and budgets should also be integrated.
Yeah, and longer term.
Definitely.
I want to ask one more question on the railways bill, and then we'll come on to, Liberal Democrat sort of ideas to do things differently, better, and so on. But the one thing I want to ask you about access. So, for 30 years, and you will have known this in your time at Network Rail, for 30 years, it was the regulator who had the final say on determining access. Now, it's going to be Great British Railways, GBR, who will make the decisions around timetable optimisation, with the regulator being an appeals body, one with teeth perhaps, but nonetheless, that it's pivoted away. Do you think that's a good thing, that we have an integrated timetable run by the railway, or is it storing up problems as well?
I think it could be a good thing, but I think the ideology that you mentioned earlier about your public sector automatically better is concerning in that context. I'm rather interested in the approach taken in the Spanish high-speed rail network, where it has been a centrally designed timetable by the state-run infrastructure company, but they've then bundled up a lot of those paths on the high-speed network and effectively auctioned them off. So now you've got 3 or 4 different operators between Barcelona and Madrid, for example, and we are seeing very clearly that is increasing ridership and reducing fares, which is surely got to be a good thing. I don't know about if it's boosting revenue overall. I would suspect it is, but those are noble objectives. So I think if we approached it from that perspective and recognise the fact that particularly for long distance competition does have a role, as it does in aviation, coach, other sectors, then it could be helpful. But if it's going to be very much about ideologically driven decisions to not have open access on the West Coast Main Line, for example, and I have said this to Lord Henley very clearly, Avanti's fares at the moment are ridiculous, completely unaffordable. I just don't bother to use it anymore because you can never get a good fare. And there's no guarantee that when Avanti moves into the public sector that will change, particularly if there's no competition on that route. So I think it has the potential to be beneficial, but they need to recognise that for those long distance routes, competition has a lot of merit as well.
But on the West Coast, let's just talk a bit about that, because there's no doubt on the East Coast Main Line, Lumo being there has led to benefits for those passengers that have used them. But those who are critics say, yeah, but it's still an indirect subsidy by the taxpayer. On the West Coast Main Line, we didn't even have that debate. The ORR said it's full. So if it's full, it's full. I mean, the danger of open access, still pushing that, is you're trying to get too much out of a system that is not able to take it. Surely Great British Railways has got to be the professional body that says whether something's full or not.
It does. I mean, I'm still trying to get my head around the West Coast Main Line thing, actually, about it being full, while certain interesting decisions about rolling stock are made. And I do have an offer from Network Rail to brief me on it, which I need to sort out from the diary perspective. But if we're saying it's full, and I accept it's fully busy, I was involved in implementing that December 2008 revolutionary West Coast Main Line timetable. If we're saying it's full, why have we introduced trains that can't tilt? People say there's a marginal sectional running time difference, but on a full railway, a marginal sectional running time difference is a decisive one. Why has the West Coast version of Lumo, as I understand it, being allowed to have train paths for 110 mile an hour Class 222 diesel trains, which clearly won't be able to keep up with others? So if it's full, why are those things being allowed to happen? If it's full, there should be an edict saying all intercity passenger trains on the West Coast Main Line must be 125 mile an hour tilt capable, because that way you'll squeeze a lot more out of that infrastructure. So I suppose what I'm saying is I'm not wholly buying the argument that it's definitely full, because there are decisions being taken which undermine what you can do with the fullness.
I want to really focus in now on the things that the Liberal Democrats would do differently. One of the things in your conference motion that was passed. There were a few amendments, I know, but there was passed. There's a lot of stuff in there. Was questioning the actual structure of GBR. You were talking about a not-for-profit or a mutual rather than a non-departmental public body. Why is that?
I think there's lots of reasons, and the government has really got itself in a mess in this. It's been really contradicting itself about whether it thinks arm's length bodies are a good thing or not. So the government has decided to scrap NHS England, which surely is the equivalent of what GBR is going to be. The government's decided to scrap the National Space Agency, our UK Space Agency, as an independent body because it's bloated, and yet they're introducing this very large one for railways. I've yet to detect the consistency and the logic of that. But I think one of the reasons why we're advocating for a different model to that is because if this organisation is going to be successful, it needs to be responsive to market demands. It needs to be responsive to what passengers want, what freight end users need. It needs to have some flair. It needs to be willing to try different things with fares and with marketing and with products and with customer experience. And were it to have more of an independent structure and more of a tightly regulated but private sector mindset, then I think that's more likely to be realised than a body that in any other sector the government says is really bloated and we need to abolish. It's very, very bizarre, the fact they're being very contradictory on this.
There was a great moment at the Transport Select Committee when when Lord Henry was there, and he got quite cross about the notion. He said, "Oh yes, lots of people in the railway say just tell us what you want and then just leave us to get on with it." But he said, "But there's loads of public money involved. That's just not realistic." Are you concerned that what they're actually doing is finding a different way to control it?
That is a big concern, that is how this could end up. Yeah, definitely. And this is what I'd really, really say to the government. And a lot of the comms that have come out heralding a new era of Great British Railways, and some of the things that they're saying are bad about the current industry, they need to look in the mirror, because a lot of those things that they're criticising are things that they themselves decided. So there's something in the comms about, we need GBR to put an end to this terrible thing of timetables that aren't integrated and connections that aren't held. Well, who's been very tightly specifying timetables for the last 20 years? It's not private sector train operating companies, it's been the Department for Transport. There's lots of examples like that. And some I mentioned earlier about some of the decisions, very short-term decisions about scrapping rolling stock prematurely. To look in the mirror and realise they're the ones who've screwed a lot of this stuff up.
But they do tend to be quite sort of selectively deaf when it comes to stuff like that. No, I completely agree. You talk about greater transparency and accountability in that motion, and they sound great. They're a bit like we need more oversight and governance. That's what the Labour is saying. How does transparency and accountability sit side by side with empowerment and allowing them to get on and be responsive to market forces?
Well, I mean, in lots of ways, actually. So a very specific example to answer your question is they've got an opportunity to do something really good with fares and retailing, selling tickets. So a concept that I'm going to be encouraging them to consider is looking at what Network Rail did with performance and operational data 15 years ago. They basically made public all of the data feeds for like real-time train running.
Yeah.
And that created this incredible ecosystem of creative people and businesses who've created things like real-time trains and a lot of the mapping things for train running information. And that's a really good example of where if you are transparent with your data, you can create a really good creative ecosystem. They could do the same with fares. If they made the fares back office that is currently under the Rail Delivery Group, one that is accessible to companies or people who want to come up with better ways of representing the availability of fares. That is a really good opportunity. So, for example, if I was going to go from London to Glasgow in a couple of months, having the data feed available so that I could see, like on a series of tables, very quickly using colours, red, amber, green, with a defined price range like you get on booking.com, where the fares are and on what trains on what day, that would be transformative in terms of helping people find the best fare and getting more bums on seats. So that kind of thing is where transparency would be really significant.
So that's a really fascinating area about fares, isn't it? Because I think when the public hear fares reform, they also, at the same time as it being easier to understand, they also hear they need to be cheaper. They are two different things, though, aren't they? And do you think there is a role for reducing fares, and who's going to pay?
Well, I think what I probably need to educate myself better is why our railway is so expensive and our fares are so high when people often feel like they're not getting good value for that. And I mean, actually, it's an idea I want to put forward. I think there should be some sort of passenger minimum guarantee. If you're paying a high fare, it should not be considered a huge win that you actually get a seat. It should not be a huge win that toilets work. There's enough space to put luggage, pushchairs, bicycles, etc. But putting that to one side, I think I think perhaps there is a bit of an assumption in Department for Transport or Treasury at the moment that all rail passengers are hostages, that they have to travel by train because they have no alternative. They won't get a car or it's not drivable on that route. And I think that's perhaps driving some of the thinking that if we reduce fares, we'll lose revenue. Private sector companies and airlines, perhaps a really good example of this. They often realise that if you reduce prices, you can increase revenue because you increase volume. And I think the people who are making these decisions about fares need to consider that possibility a lot more. And then, of course, there's all sorts of things. There's no question the railway needs to be much better at managing cost so that value for money is better.
And one of the areas where cost and value for money is a big issue is electrification. I want to talk about electrification. You have made this very much one of your core celebs and talk about it very articulately at the Transport Select Committee. We're here on the Great Western. Main line is just to one side of us. The line to Oxford is just to the other side. That was going to be electrified. It got canned, as a lot of other bits of the Great Western did, because it just became too expensive. Yet in your motion, you said, we're going to make it a requirement that new lines are electrified as sort of standard, and we're going to get a rolling program of electrification back underway. Is it affordable?
Well, it seems to be affordable in every other country in Europe. So yes, okay, we have some challenges here in terms of loading gauge, but this organisation that everyone is constantly saying was a shambles, called British Rail, was very good at electrifying railways, including often some ones with very challenging structures. Think of all of those tunnels coming into King's Cross. They were wired up in the mid 1970s. Yeah. Viaducts on the East Coast Main Line done in the late 1980s. So that would be my first answer to that. It doesn't have to be as unaffordable as it has been hitherto. I think Network Rail now has a good understanding for why a lot of the cost for Great Western electrification went out of hand. They've done a lot of good learning on that. They've been good at getting their, to use the jargon, standard track kilometre electrification cost rates down in Scotland. And with a rolling programme, there is every opportunity for that to continue. I mean, and this is the paradox, actually. Just exactly at the time that Network Rail has got good at some of that stuff, and some of the really creative things with structures, like applying the insulating paint, so you have to rebuild fewer bridges. Exactly as they've really started to master that, the government has become more anti-electrification than even Margaret Thatcher's government, and that really is quite extraordinary, really. So we need to have it, and it's not just about decarbonisation. It is about significantly improving the capability of the railways that we have, because particularly for freight, if it's fully electric, it gets out of the way so much quicker. You can have so much more in there, and it's much better for performance. Electric trains, much more reliable. Loads of good reasons for doing it, not just decarbonisation. And I think that's perhaps what's gone wrong. Is government has got obsessed with the decarbonisation aspect. That's one of a large number of benefits of electrifying our railways.
The narrative now seems to be discontinuous electrification, the use of hybrid technology, more batteries, because that's more cost effective and it's less intrusive. I must admit, I mean, we're probably about to start agreeing with each other very strongly. It seems to me just missing the point that, on main lines, putting the wires up is going to be a better solution. Are you worried about this whole battery hybrid discontinuous debate, or do you think it's just it's okay as long as it keeps it in its rightful place?
Oh, I think it's about the right solution for the right type of railway. So if you take a railway like Hull to Scarborough, which has got very limited freight potential, a couple of trains an hour, not particularly high line speed, I think that's fine for batteries with the occasional bit of wire for charging on the go if you need it halfway. Fine, but when I hear it being talked about Midland Main Line, which I do occasionally hear about, or railways like Newbury to Exeter, I just think we've completely lost the plot. And anybody in the rail industry who likes the idea of discontinuous electrification, it's not quite setting you a challenge. I'm giving the opportunity to educate me as to why I'm wrong on this. I keep asking people, if you take something like East West Rail, 100-mile-an-hour railway, or Chiltern, where Chiltern's managing director couldn't be more effusive about how discontinuous electrification is the right solution for that railway, which I don't know how many trains an hour in each direction these days, 8 of 100-mile-an-hour line speed. Show me anywhere else in the world, apart from the UK, where people are proposing discontinuous electrification for railways like that, because no one has yet given me an example. In Germany, they're doing it on secondary lines where there's limited freight and maybe 1 train an hour in each direction, and I've got no objection to that. But our main lines should be treated as main lines, and bringing that amazing capacity, amazing acceleration and reliability capability that every other form of transport would dream of, the ability to provide 25,000 volts of power continuously to your line of route. You can't do it with road, you can't do it with planes, you definitely can't do it with ships. We should be doing it on railways.
That's pretty clear. Well, there's a great challenge. I hope you'll be flooded with answers on that. Can we turn to another area that causes some quite divisive debate, and that's rolling stock, and particularly the financing, the funding of rolling stock. So you have two groups. One group says the Roscoes actually enabled the raising of capital away from the public sector balance sheet in a very effective way, and it enabled trains to be bought that otherwise wouldn't have been if we'd been reliant on the Treasury finding the funds. On the other hand, you got a bunch of people saying absolutely disgraceful. All that dividends, just leaching it out the money. It should all have been reinvested in the railway. Who, in your view, is right in that debate?
Well, I hate to be a terrible Lib Dem and say that neither of those views is completely right, and perhaps more a blend of the two. So I think my view, from as I understand things, is rolling stock leasing makes most sense where it's a genuinely competitive market, and there is likely to be changing demands for the type of train or locomotive concerned. So, for example, were I to get booted out of Parliament and decide to set up a Central European freight operating company, it would probably make sense for me to lease my Vectron locomotives, or whichever type of a locomotive you wish to choose, as long as it's electric. It would make sense for me to lease those, because with something like freight, it is likely that it will increase or decrease in terms of economic cycles. It's quite likely, or in terms of changes of the market changes, and a freight end user wants to move to a different supply where it's genuinely competitive.
Yeah.
There's lots of different people who could do it. That would make sense. And also there's lots of other people who would want Vectron locomotives, because you've got
liquid market.
Yeah, you've got a large railway, similar electrification standards or whatever. If you're buying trains for something like Crossrail, the Elizabeth line, as we must call it now. If you're buying trains for that, I'd struggle to see the point of leasing them, because you're always going to need them. Who else is going to need them? Or why would you stop needing them? So, and the issue with leasing is, look, and this isn't a criticism of the rolling stock companies, because it's they're very clear as to what they are. Logically must cost more during the whole life of the asset if you're leasing it than if you're buying it. It must do, because otherwise none of us would ever buy houses without a mortgage. We would always choose to have a mortgage voluntarily, and if we didn't need them. So that's perhaps my concern, is if where it's a type of train, a type of service that you're always going to need, and effectively is only ever going to be one use case for it, then I'm not sure I'm persuaded of the case. And the argument about trying to get around Treasury, from what I have read, from what past select committees have looked at, it has increased costs, rolling stock leasing. So it might deal with the Treasury's very bizarre aversion to large spikes in capital spending, but logically it probably will cost more over the whole life of the asset.
I wonder whether the debate has changed a bit though. I mean, Roscoe's 30 years ago, it was all very much tax-based financing. I mean, the rules have changed now.
Yeah.
So now, I think there probably is an argument that if government borrowing is based on 10-year gilts, if the Roscoe is actually a lessor, is a pension fund, and is really only interested in very predictable costs, but actually their cost of funds is below gilts, it might make sense. So is it just not really, we shouldn't have an ideological aversion to them, it's just, again, it's whatever deal makes sense at the time.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that. And look, even though I might have some scepticism, I'd just like to assure you I'm not going to be going on the warpath about rolling stock companies. The government's very clear that they're here to stay. And, they do bring a lot of good things to the table. We're Porterbrick here, I know they would say, and then they're not wrong. They have brought a lot of investment in terms of refurbishing trains, and they're currently putting a huge amount of investment into the Long Marston facility in Warwickshire to turn that into more of a testing facility than just a place for old trains to go and die. So they do bring positives to the table, and yes, I certainly agree we shouldn't be ideological about it.
Talking something else that's become a bit of an ideological football, again, was in the Lib Dem motion that you passed at conference, HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail. So you said Northern Powerhouse Rail, just get on and do it. And HS2, actually, you would look seriously at reinstating the bits that have been cancelled and certainly look at a way of reconnecting to Manchester. Do you think that is politically attractive at the moment? Because there is quite an undercurrent that high-speed rail's on a little bit of a downer at the moment.
Well, it certainly is in the UK, and for entirely understandable reasons, because there's lots of reasons for why it's the case. HS2 has been a total and utter shambles. I mean, both in terms of how long it's taking, how much it's costing. No one can argue with that. I mean, literally nobody can argue with it. But we do still need it, and the need for it north of the West Midlands has not decreased. And what we really need to do is learn the lessons as to why HS2 has been such a mess up to now, and implement those lessons. There is no reason for it to cost that much. In fact, no other high-speed line anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm aware, has ever cost that much. The real learning point here is from the French, and it's not as simple as some people say that, the French planning system is so easy, they just bludgeon it through. Sir John Armitt gave really good testimony to the Select Committee earlier in the year about how they planned the Tours to Bordeaux high-speed line, which, for those who don't know, is 200 miles of 200-mile-an-hour railway with 6 grade-separated junctions onto the classic network to give that connectivity to
That's very similar to what was planned,
yeah,
right?
Okay. Indeed. And they spent 10 years planning that. 10 years before they even lifted up a piece of ballast. Let's go with that. 10 years, that's a long time, but they took all of that time to get everything agreed, be very clear what we're trying to deliver, what are all the planning issues, what are all the things people are going to kick off about, and then they built it in 4 years for €9 billion. And that railway is fantastic. It's Paris to Bordeaux, 2 hours, 5 minutes, and Paris to the Spanish border, 4.5 hours. In fact, I used it on the way back from Spain in early September. So there are things that we can learn about that. Of course, our planning system's not the same as France's, but it's not an easy ride there either. French people are hardly known for their easygoing nature when there's something being proposed to them that they don't like.
Yeah.
So that's what we really need to learn from. And if that means that we don't start building anything towards the northwest or northeast for another 10 years, so we get that planning right, so be it, as long as we can build it in good time and to a good budget.
Defenders of HS2 would say part of the reason for the cost, though, was not so much the planning system, but the planning system and environmental legislation meant we ended up building tunnels we don't really need, structures we don't really need, mitigations we don't really need, bat sheds that we don't really need because of a colony of Beckstein's bats at Sheep House Wood. The Liberal Democrat approach to environmental protection is pretty strong. You're not going to find challenges within your own party. Say, well, I want to have HS2, but then another part said, yeah, but we need all of this mitigation because the environment we think it's even more important than the last lot.
Well, I certainly think that the debate between things that are needed from a sort of national use case perspective and local concerns is a challenging one. But I know quite a lot about that debate because I was one of the Lib Dems on the Bill Committee scrutinising the government's planning and infrastructure bill. And whilst, of course, there are elements of the planning system that need to be improved, there have been a lot of straw men and scapegoats created as part of this. And I think perhaps there's been a false dichotomy between environmental protection and the ability to plan and deliver things. I just think the issue of HS2 is a lot of those arguments were being had once they'd already started building it. And then you get into the whole scope change, value engineering, to use that awful euphemism, whilst you've already started building it. And I think that's the biggest of HS2. Those debates about what the right solution is in terms of tunnelling or not, it should have been happened before, and long before anyone started building it. That, I think, is the key learning point.
But do you think then that the Chancellor of the Exchequer's language over we seem to care too much about bats and newts, and not enough about children's life chances, or she was talking about in the context of the sort of the environment versus economic growth trade-off. That doesn't sound like terribly helpful language, and you're saying just plan it better.
It's not helpful language at all, and it's far too oversimplifying. I mean, goodness me, if you look at the Channel Tunnel rail link, or I was going to say what we now call High Speed 1, but no, we don't. Now we call it London St Pancras High Speed. Anyway, whatever it's called this week, if you look at that was before a lot of the environmental legislation that we have now. That still took ages to plan and to build. I mean, French opened their high-speed line to the Channel Tunnel for 1994 and the start of operations. It took us until 2007 to finish it. But that project is a good example of where, yes, it took ages to have those arguments, but then it was built on time and within a reasonable budget. But it's not a new issue. You know, a lot of the time there was a huge opposition to that high-speed line going through Kent. But now I think you don't hear any complaints about it because people recognise the benefit and people have got used to having it there. So it's an interesting case study. And yes, there's a lot of scapegoating of planning and environmental stuff that's unhelpful.
Right at the other end of the scale, away from HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail, we've got the reopening of long closed lines and reopening of stations. One of the things I did sort of land on in the conference motion was restoring the reversing beaching, or restoring your railways fund. I'll probably get that completely messed up, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
That was a £500 million fund, but most of it was just for feasibility studies, wasn't it? I mean, when it costs well over 300 million to open the Northumberland line, I'm not saying that wasn't a good thing to do, by the way, it always feels to me like this is trying to rewind history rather than be progressive. But I'm presuming that, no, you actually think there is value in looking at some of these reopenings.
Oh, well, definitely. I mean, I've got a big campaign in my own constituency for reopening a station in a place called Grove, which serves Grove and the next door town of Wantage. And the reason why that campaign is really viable, and I have had some promising conversations with government, is because that area has completely changed in character compared to the 1960s when that station was closed. There's been enormous growth in housing in the surrounding area, and travelling patterns have changed. People commute much further these days than they did. And I think that should perhaps be the test of these things, is there should be some clear criteria for schemes that should have feasibility studies or should move to the next phase of actually building them. Is, has there been significant increase in housing? Is there significantly more local employment? Is there a transport problem in terms of, chronic congestion getting to and from Oxford, for example? And I think by laying out those criteria clearly, we could speak to your point that railways are better at doing some things than others. And I'm kind of always a bit uncomfortable agreeing with the Conservatives on things, but restoring your railway, that was a good idea, if not implemented brilliantly. But if there was to be a pot of money, and I kind of, on one level, I don't really care how much money it is, but people could bid into with their ideas, then you'd keep that pipeline going of schemes for the future. And people would learn over time what the criteria are and what's successful. So I would encourage the government to bring that kind of thing back. Because at the moment, to be honest, it seems to be quite arbitrary what the criteria are. I mean, ministers have said to the select committee there's no money for anything, and then a few weeks later they say, and suddenly find £120 million behind the sofa for reopening the Oxford Cowley branch. Something I welcome, by the way. But at the moment, I'd say, coming back to that transparency point, it's not entirely clear what the criteria are. I'm
glad you mentioned that one, because when we asked the department, they actually said, oh no, the money for reopening the branch to Cowley was in the spending review. And I must admit thinking, well, it was pretty well hidden then, or I must have lost that page because I couldn't find it. It just seemed a bit random, doesn't it?
Well, it wasn't there. I mean, I looked in detail at the tables they presented as to why they were doing some things or why they were deferring others, like Midland Main electrification or York remodelling, and it definitely wasn't on there. And I know for a fact it wasn't, because all of my colleagues in Oxfordshire, whether Lib Dem or Labour for that matter, would have been delirious and effusive in their gratitude. So yes, I'm not sure that holds water really.
That was very much my thought too. If it had been there, they would have found it impossible to be quiet about it. So quite. No, quite. I want to ask you one final thing, and it's not sort of saving the best to last, but it's really important: freight. Because we're here at Didcot, and it isn't important freight location as well. There's lots of freight trains go through here. Everybody kind of says it's a good idea, but then sometimes finds it hard to work out how to really stimulate it and support it. What's the Liberal Democrats' approach to rail freight and helping it grow?
Well, I think we need to listen to the sector to understand what they need and look at other countries where rail freight is a much higher percentage of things. I mean, sorry to be an electrification bore, but I was recently travelling across Germany, which, by the way, I'm not going to hold up as a beacon of excellence because from a passenger perspective, it's even more shambolic than usual. But I lost count of how many freight trains I saw along the way, and every single one of them had an electric locomotive at the front. Whereas here, you hardly ever see any freight trains with electric locomotive, not least around here because, well, the key bits haven't been electrified.
Yeah.
So we need to listen to them as to what they need. And I know that the freight sector is pretty worried by GBR in terms of how that mechanism for access allocation and the ORR as an appellant body will work in practice, and whether GBR potentially threatens getting the best balance between passenger and freight. But we need to do a lot more in terms of investing in those sort of road rail interchange facilities from a freight perspective, and yeah, do some bits of infill electrification, and just give the freight industry that confidence that they are welcome on our railway, because I think at the moment they're worried that they won't be.
Actually, there is one final thing, if I may, and you've just sort of triggered it in my mind talking about freight. Devolved bodies, mayoral combined authorities, local authorities. One part of this government seems to suggest they want to devolve a lot to them. But you look at the railways bill that's been published, and it does seem to me at least, it says, no, Great British Railways will have a duty to consult and be very engaged, but it doesn't have to obey, right?
Yes.
And that's, yeah, I've consulted with you, you've told me what you think, but now I'm going to do what I was going to do anyway. That is the risk, is it? Yeah. Would you take a different approach?
Well, I think you're certainly right. There is a risk that it will be a duty to consult and an obligation or right to ignore. Well, look, if the government is serious about devolution, of course we need to take that seriously. But I think perhaps the current approach of it all being about fairly small combined authorities is going to be quite difficult to realise the potential of rail in that context. Yeah. I think if you look to France and Germany and other places, their devolution is, as well as on a city level, is on a regional basis. And actually, coming back to what we were talking about in terms of ideology between public and private sector, as a result of regional governments in France and Germany being able to take more control of who runs regional services, we've been seeing more private sector involvement actually, because they've used some of those tendering things to give SNCF or Deutsche Bahn a kick up the, end wagon or whatever. So, and I think that's we probably need to think more regionally about that, and I've got some concerns about the fact that the government appears to be determined to scrap subnational transport bodies, like Transport for the North, etc. Because the danger is if it's combined authority areas that are deciding their own rail things, you could get to very disjointed things between boundaries, between like Greater Manchester and West Yorkshire as an example. So I think our approach would be making sure that there is more regional oversight and thinking more on a regional basis about these services, not just, and we must make sure it isn't just about combined authority barriers, because rail doesn't really work like that. You can do combined authority boundaries probably work well for bus, although even there's cross-border issues. Rail's a bit more about the longer distance picture.
Absolutely. Just to sum up the whole thing, really. I mean, it is a pivotal moment, isn't it? I mean, I suppose if you want to be charitable, actually, this government's done quite a lot in 18 months compared to where we were with rail for the previous number of years. Do you have a sense of optimism at the moment that we are at least moving forward with something, or do you still see a lot of clouds ahead that need to be dealt with, problems that need to be navigated?
I think I see in front of me a colourful cocktail of optimism and despair. So I think with the Railways Bill, I think they do deserve credit for having done some serious thinking as to what the best future way forward is. Clearly I'm not going to agree with all of the outputs of that thinking, but they have been thinking hard, and perhaps we've not had that for a long time. The despair is more in terms of the actual policy decisions being made at the moment, which, frankly, is just largely a continuation of what we've had before under the Conservatives. There's no electrification being committed beyond schemes that already have been. Fares reform still seems to be further away than ever before, and they seem very reluctant to set themselves any ambitious targets in terms of growing revenue or growing patronage, or really making sure rail fulfills its role in terms of helping to reduce congestion or increase accessibility to jobs, etc. They still seem to be in a kind of mindset of, oh, God, what a nuisance all of this stuff is. How can we sort of manage the exorbitant cost as best as possible? That's the wrong way of thinking about it. It's given that railways do cost a lot, how can we make the most of it? How can we perhaps spend that 5% more to really maximise the benefit of what we've already got and make sure it realises its potential? That's what I want to see more of.
That's a really positive, uplifting way to end. Olly Glover, thank you so much for your time. We'll be, following the debate on the Railways Bill very closely. I know you'll be very much a part of that, and perhaps in a few months' time we'll be able to have another chat and see how we all think things have gone. But for now, Olly Glover MP, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.